I don't know all the technical specifics all the time, but I do consider myself a fan of technology. From an early age, I got addicted to the family computer with all the games I could play on it and Word documents I could write on. I figured out how to navigate that baby real nicely, and by the time a guest teacher came into our elementary school to teach us the basics of word processors and search engines, I was practically already a self-taught pro. However, my pale complexion might tip you off that I spent a lot of my childhood indoors on that computer. Smartphones weren't really a thing until I got into high school, but I definitely had a form of technology addiction. It was hard to rip me away from that. My parents even eventually put an automatic screen timer on my computer, and it was the greatest travesty of my life every time. The time was up, and I couldn't do anything on the computer anymore. Well, today's guest is talking about technology, idolatry, and distraction, topics near and dear to my heart. Andrew Noble is a pastoral assistant in Ontario, Canada, a podcast host of 3 shows, including the great show What Would Jesus Tech? And he's working on his PhD at Nottingham. Our culture runs on values contrary to Christ. We're surrounded by a million voices competing for our attention. Even in our own churches, sometimes our eyes aren't firmly on Jesus. So one question remains: who or what do you truly worship? Welcome to the Smashing Idols podcast. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is your call to break free from the things that pull you away from Jesus Christ. Each week I chat with theologians, ministers, cultural thinkers, and everyday believers to uncover how modern idols sneak into our lives and how we can smash them to pieces. We're not here for surface-level faith. We're here to dig deep, challenge the norms, rediscover what it means to follow Jesus with everything we've got. So if you're ready to kick distractions to the curb and embrace a faith worth living, you've come to the right place. And hey, don't forget to check out jakedoberenz.com/podcast to catch every episode and subscribe to the newsletter. So, you ready? Let's start smashing those idols. Well, Andrew, it is great to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Looking forward to this.
Absolutely. You deal with a lot of topics that are right up my alley, right in my wheelhouse. And so I'm super excited to discuss more about these things.
Hopefully you're over your tech addiction, but if you're honest, maybe you're still struggling with some degree of dopamine hits when you are on your computer too long.
Yeah, it's tough because, I work remotely and I am literally on my computer all day long. And so it becomes difficult. And especially in the modern day where, when you work at home, work and play kind of intersect in weird ways. So working on it. How about this? I'll say this: recovering, kind of actively recovering from the tech addiction. That's what I'll say.
That's good. That's good.
Well, let's just go ahead and jump in with question number 1. Andrew, you had an intense moment when you worked for a tech company and were flown into an important meeting in New York City. You learned an important lesson from that. What happened in that meeting and what did you learn?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever shared this story publicly, but essentially I was working at a fruit company a tech company named after a fruit. It was not a fruit company. We did not sell fruit. We sold HR software, and there's a company in New York that it was kind of the final big presentation to do a pilot program. It was only going to be like a 10-month program, but it was going to be over $100,000. A pretty big deal for us as a small company. We were not Apple. We were not BlackBerry. We were Plum. So a tech company named after a fruit. There was maybe 20 of us at the time. And yeah, so we go up the elevator, we do the presentation, we're in the Q&A, and I'm trying my best, right? I feel the intensity in the room. Their CEO is there. My CEO is next to me. We also have like our chief science officer. And there's kind of a conversation. I was like, I gotta say something. I felt it internally that like they're not seeing the value. So I jumped in, kind of interrupted someone, and I said what I thought I should say. And then the CEO stops everyone. He says, "Hey," and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, "You need to learn when to stop talking." And he said more things after that, but I don't remember because I was like shell shocked. I'm just sitting there on my heels or standing there in my heels, and I keep my mouth shut the entire rest of the thing. Like there's no way I'm saying a word after that. And he was right. My colleagues reminded me after that maybe he didn't need to say it so intensely, and maybe he was wrong and he just was having an ego moment, whatever. But there really was an important lesson that sometimes the best thing you can do in a conversation is say nothing. And some of us, we like to hear ourselves think out loud, and that's not always effective. We need to think before we speak, and be slow to speak. So I'm still working on that. I'm recovering in that as well. But yeah, no, it's definitely an important lesson for me that I try to live out, even though I podcast and do all sorts of things that require me to speak.
Right. I was going to say, doing ministry and podcasting, it's a lot of speaking, but it is good advice for sure to maybe use some wisdom and apply that to things in life. It makes me think of like Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time for this and a time for that, and so we got to apply that wisdom in all of that. Well, I appreciate that opening story. We got to learn a little bit about your background. You obviously have a tech background as well as ministry and theological education. And I'm excited for you to do some speaking today, because hopefully today I will learn to not speak as much and let you give all your great wisdom. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, you worked in the tech sector. You were in ministry. Now you're working on a PhD in theology in Nottingham. And I don't know, can you just kind of tell us about this journey? What came first, pastor or technologist? Tell us about this intersection between the two in your life.
Yeah, well, I'm 35 years old now. So when I was 19, that's when I maybe became a Christian. I don't know. There's a whole story there, but essentially around 19 years old, I am just so loving God, loving learning about him, starting a Bible study on my own just to like get people learning about God and loving him and just being passionate about it. And I want to go into ministry right before I turned 20. After a year of that, it's like, I want to go into ministry, but I didn't want to be disconnected from the world. And that instinct at that time is really important in my story because I just didn't want to be pie in the sky. I didn't want to be the academic. I didn't want to leave my friends who I had made in the first year of university and just go off and go to a Bible only place where it's all Christians. I wanted to connect what I was learning to how people are living. And so I went through my seminary degree part-time while I worked in different jobs. I worked in bureaucracies and organizations like student unions and stuff like that. And I wanted to do things. I didn't want to work in the bureaucracy. And so I had an itch to join a startup, ended up at Plum, the company I referenced earlier, just so that I could like be entrepreneurial. I studied kinesiology in my undergrad. After I became a Christian, I ended up getting a minor in religious studies, which at a secular university like the University of Waterloo had a very different spin on Christianity. So that kind of raised my senses towards an apologetic, the need for apologetics in the church. So yeah, I was always kind of wrestling with those two. Enjoyed working at Plum, enjoyed working in that tech world, and saw the power of technology. Someone has recently said that they believe that culture is downstream from technology, which is interesting. Sometimes we think there's a culture and then technology comes out of the culture because it's kind of like what's in the culture. No. It goes the other way. That technology really does impact how we live, what we believe, what the norms are in society. To take one easy example, the car. You introduce a car into a society and all of a sudden people are treating their church differently. They can drive by 5, 6, 7 different churches to go to some other church that they never would have had before. Church hopping or church shopping becomes a thing because of the car. And so there's so much impact that technology has that I think it's essential for Christians to think well on this issue. Not that it's the most important thing to think about in the whole wide world. No. Let's not overdo it. Every person who becomes an expert or tries to become an expert in something has a tendency to say, this is the most important subject and all other subjects aren't important. Well, I don't want to say that, but I do want to say that we should all take some time to think about the technologies, especially the technologies in our life, and not simply whether or not that technology is, beneficial for you. What can it do for me? Can this technology get me to A to B faster? Well, that's not the only question you need to ask. You need to ask a lot more questions, and you need to think about, what kind of person am I becoming? What are the trade-offs and all this other kind of stuff. And so I've enjoyed thinking about it, started the podcast, What Would Jesus Tech, like 2-3 years ago now, and I haven't gotten bored of it. So then I was like, well, let's turn this project into a PhD, got accepted. And so I'm working on the intersection of theology and technology for my PhD studies.
I love that. And as I mentioned before we started recording, like that's some research interest that I have and might want to pursue some PhD stuff on. And I resonate with that. And I'm sure we could get into some of the nerdy stuff too, because I know, having read your works, you quote from like Neil Postman. And I just figure because you're Canadian, you probably like Marshall McLuhan too, or something like that, So
of course.
Yeah, exactly. We could nerd out about that, but I want to note something. I want to talk more specifically too in a second here about the topic you're kind of dealing with for your dissertation. Now, Andrew, you're not like Amish, obviously, who just steps away from all modern technology. Gotta get out of the system, kind of thing. You're not a Luddite who destroys the technology, and you're not a third category who would just embrace it and let's not think critically at all about technology. Let's just get the latest everything device. But, you see some dangers in technology. There are some red flags out there, of course. And from my understanding, your current dissertation project is exploring technology and idolatry. And, this is now called the Smashing Idols podcast. And so I think it'd be very appropriate to talk about, the ways in which you see technology kind of work as idolatry. And I know there are plenty of questions probably you haven't answered yet in your project, but, just give us a peek into that world and that relationship between tech and idolatry.
Yeah, part of the challenge in the world is that you almost are trained how to make simple questions more complicated. Mm-hmm. Like, what do we really mean by idolatry? What do we mean by worship? And all this kind of stuff. The Heidelberg Catechism just kind of says idolatry is taking anything and serving it or trusting in it or resting in it in any way above God. So it's taking anything, any created thing. Like Paul talks about this in Romans 1. It doesn't need to be complicated. You don't need to read a dissertation or a 300-page book in order to understand that anything can become an idol. Anything can. Ezekiel talks about in Ezekiel 14, they created idols in their heart. So there are things that happen inside of us, just ways that we attribute certain security to or potential satisfaction, some sort of that sort of need fulfillment. And so you have that with technology. One of the things I'm working through is thinking about different ways that the Bible talks about technology. There's at least 8 ways. So I'll just go through all 8 quickly. Idols as images. So like if you think about the 10 commandments, the second commandment, it doesn't use the word idol. It uses, you shall not make an image of the Lord your God, right? So idols as images. Another is idol as man-made. Often it's the reference of man-made rather than made by God. There is this contrast. There's a huge contrast between what we can make and what God can make. The Bible wants to make that clear. So idols as images, idols as man-made, idols as other gods. So what are these idols and what are these other gods? Because sometimes these idols are mixed with other gods. They're spoken of in that way in Scripture. Are there other gods? And so Christopher Wright talks about this, not to nerd out too much, but he talks about there's something there, but there's also nothing there. There's nothing really in terms of how the Bible talks about it, like in Isaiah. where it's like you make this thing out of a piece of wood and half of it you use in the fire and the other half you bow down to worship. Like the point is that the idols are nothing. And that's literally the word havel, which is used in Ecclesiastes to speak of the meaninglessness of stuff. That's what Jeremiah uses to talk about idols. But they're nothing. They're I heard one prof say it this way, that those soap bubbles, you when you're playing with kids and you get the little thing of soap and you blow it, and that's that bubble. If you can picture that bubble right now, that's like an idol. It's there, it's something, but it's really nothing, and it's about to pop. That is a way to think about them. They're kind of like nothing, or another way is idols as not life. Don't actually consist of real life. There's also idols as demons. There's idols as kind of forming us to be like them and then destructing us through that. So we become like what we worship. And so sometimes we lose our life because of the way that we end up worshiping these idols. Idols as relational betrayal, whether that's like a lover, God is our husband, and Hosea, the people betray God by seeking after other gods, and that idolatry is spoken of as a kind of relational betrayal. Or even as we're supposed to be like children of God, we end up worshiping things instead of him and betray that relationship that we have with God. And then lastly, idolatry as emotional fulfillment. So when we think about those 8 categories, you can easily apply each one of those things to technology. And some of those are just obvious. Like images, we live in an image-filled society now. I'm looking at the image right now, or at least I can if I lean over a bit, where images are everywhere. And you open up Snapchat and the default is to see your own camera on yourself. Like I have a mirror, but no, Snapchat knows better, because they want you to see your image and put your image so that other people might serve and worship that image. They don't say that explicitly, and I'm not saying that all social media is bad, but we need to recognize, just as the biblical authors did, that there's a logic to idols. There's a way in which they want to shape us. And if we don't recognize how idols shape the people of Israel, we won't recognize how technology shapes us. And so I'm basically going through some of these things of idols as man-made. They're like other gods. They might be demon-possessed. Yeah, there might be a demon in ChatGPT. I'm just going to say it. Like, there might be, like, I believe in spiritual forces. If you're a Christian who believes the Bible, so do you. I'm not saying that that's true of ChatGPT or true of the person you walk down the street or true of this, but I'm just saying it's possible. And that's how the Bible talks about it. And it's rare that the Bible talks about idolatry or idols as being demon possessed or whatever, but it's there enough that we should pay attention to it. So yeah, there's all of these aspects of how the Bible talks about idols. And I think it's incredibly relevant for our technological society today, that we need to recognize, especially the human side of idolatry. Humans seek after, they're enticed by these things, and why is that? Like, why did the people, when Moses went up to get the 10 Commandments, why did they build the golden calf? Like, have you ever just stopped to think about that? Like, it does seem pretty odd, doesn't it? Well, if you read the text and you read what it says, it's something like they did not know where Moses was. They didn't know what would come of him. And so this kind of boredom almost and a lack of knowledge, what do? They got to do something with their hands, a busyness. And I think, thinking about, you mentioned distraction at the beginning and addiction, like there's a lot of similarities there between just keeping busy with our hands. Instead of manufacturing idols, we swipe our screens. And that's what we've started to do, instead of taking those moments of boredom and directing them toward God or fruitful endeavors.
Well, that was a really good segue. It's almost like you've seen the questions ahead of time, because I wanted to ask you about distraction specifically and how technology distracts us from things. And you wrote an interesting article for the Gospel Coalition about technology distracting us from wonder specifically. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, this kind of lost thing of wonder, and how something specifically social media might take away that sense of wonder or imagination from believers.
Yeah, well, it's like I was kind of describing with the golden calf. you have those moments where you don't know what God might instruct of you. You have a general idea of ethical principles and you're kind of doing stuff in life, but do you really know what you're doing it for? Do you really have a sense of meaning? This actually goes back to when I was 19 years old. I came out of a Bible study, and in the Bible study, a friend of mine asked me, "How are you doing?" And then I said, "I don't know, I'm doing all right." But then he stopped me, put his hand on my shoulder, said, "How are you doing?" And that kind of shook me in this weird, visceral way, not a physical way, but just emotionally. I was like, what am I doing with my life? And I went back into the car to go home from this Bible study. And I had a 10, 15-minute drive home. And it felt like an encounter with God. I don't know, I couldn't describe an audible voice that I heard, but I have no doubt that God was using that moment to address the meaninglessness of how I was living my life compared to finding my meaning in Him. And I wonder how different it would have been if I had had AI-generated playlist on, when I got into that car that automatically connected on Bluetooth. This is back in 2008. I had a dumb phone by today's standards. So there's just a distraction built into our environments that we don't acknowledge. And so we sit there in our lonely moments. Blaise Pascal, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit in a quiet room alone. And we really do struggle with it. We just want to fill our time with something, to do things with our hands. And so social media is an outlet for that. Now, not all social media is bad and all those sorts of things, but I would just encourage listeners, as I encourage myself, is to identify in those moments where you're uncomfortable because you're alone or it's quiet or you're bored. If you're just kind of numbing your feelings instead of experiencing life. I think there's a numbing effect of these technologies, and we have really a choice of, will we choose life? Will we choose to experience those moments with our kids, those moments with our neighbors, experience the nature around us, experience God who is around us? The mistake we can sometimes make is thinking that we either live a tech world or a natural world, as if, you can either do a bunch of technology stuff, or you can be like the Wendell Berry nature kind of person and enjoy trees and sunsets and all that. And it's not about tech or nature as supernatural. God is present in your world. You can experience life with Him. Yes, as you use technology even, but do you open up that reality or do you numb yourself to it? And that's kind of like a heartbeat of how I've tried to make decisions in my own life over the last few years is, okay, what is actually producing life? And I need to make choices related to the devices I use, the apps I download, all those sorts of things, if it's actually giving me life or if it's sucking it. And I think social media, for some of us, we just need to delete it because it's soul-sucking.
Yeah, absolutely. I might not have that same kind of computer game addiction that I had as a kid, but that's replaced by these things called social media, and had to delete TikTok a couple of years ago too, because that was just it's literally designed to keep you on forever. You're like, what happened?
Yeah.
It's been 3 hours. So that is good to think about what gives us life. What is life giving? That is a very good way to navigate these complex problems. Andrew, I have another question for you. Is distraction all bad? Is there really a harm in just taking a break to watch a TV show or scrolling on your phone while you're waiting in line? Do you think it's a sin to be distracted by mindless entertainment? I mean, if you could kind of put on your pastoral hat for a moment and help us out here, is it that bad?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because I think our tendency, and what I want to push back on, is this really black and white approach to any sort of tech around us. So it's okay to use Siri, but it's not okay to use TikTok. It's okay to use a car, but it's not okay to, I don't know, worship with a chat bot to help you find Bible verses or something like that. There are ways that technology can be used for good and harm, and there's also ways in which it shapes us in one way or the other. There's three kinds of distraction. One way is willful good distractions. So let's say you're like really anxious about something, your mind is being bothered. You could turn on an audio Bible and listen to Psalm 32, and you could distract yourself with Psalm 32. I do not think that's a bad distraction, right? Using a ton of technology in just the simple pressing play on an audio Bible, but yeah, it's a good distraction. Then in the second category, I would say there's less good distractions. Like if I send a funny basketball meme to a friend, it's not like the same as worshiping God through prayer, and it's just sending a meme, but it's just less good. And then sinful distractions. So let's say sending a crude joke to a friend or something like that. Then all of a sudden, okay, you're passing the line because you're going against what the Bible speaks about in terms of good language and that sort of thing. So in that middle category, I think a lot of Christians and a lot of the rhetoric around social media tends to be very strong against just any form of social media unless you're a missionary. And I think I have a similar posture to you personally with TikTok or any short form vertical video. Like, man, I just find that stuff like cocaine. It's just not healthy, not life producing. But there's a lot of freedom in the Christian life. I think that sometimes we're just down because life is hard. And so we play a game of online chess, or we turn on a video game that's, a bit more visually stimulating than a chessboard, or we scroll some social media app. And yeah, you could be sinning, but you might not be. Like, I don't know. I don't know where you're at, the listener listening to this, or you, Jake, when you're on, I want to be careful because you could be doing like the golden calf episode and filling that void, that relational void that you might feel from God or from others. Where's Moses? Moses, come back. Oh, we'll just make our own. And we'll bow down to worship it. It's like, yeah, you might be doing it at that level. Anything can become an idol in your heart, any created thing. So it could be an idol, but it might not be. And you want to be cautious with recognizing things as idols in every single place. And one of the reasons why I wrote the article is to recognize that feeling of numbness, that feeling of like something's wrong. Yeah, something's wrong. Like if you're human, you've had this feeling. You're kind of like, you're at the end of the day and you feel like something's wrong. You're like, man, and sometimes it's hard to pin it down. Sometimes it's clear, but often it's really hard to pin down. And that sense of something's off is actually a good thing to recognize. It's not a bad thing to recognize. And our distractions, our digital distractions, can make us aware when we recognize, oh, this is not giving me life. Well, then the question is, what is? The good of digital distractions is that it kind of makes us aware of the divide between our experience in this world where something's wrong compared to the world that we are actually made for. And so there is a desire, C.S. Lewis talks about this, there is a desire in each one of us that cannot be fulfilled on earth, a hunger, a thirst that no drink or food will satisfy. And we were made for heaven. And so the good in recognizing our digital distractions and recognizing that we go to them because of this sense of offness or this sense of, I just can't sit in a quiet room alone. Well, yeah, you can't, because you were made for heaven. You weren't made for a quiet room alone. And so we really need to just recognize, it kind of gets back to like before we hit record, like, who are we as humans? What were we made for? That's kind of what I'm trying to tap into in that article.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And we'll link to that one as well in the show notes, another Gospel Coalition article that Andrew wrote and helped us think about these important topics. Well, I'm wondering if you can kind of talk to the hypothetical / maybe me tech-addicted Christian for a moment. Somebody who understands, okay, something about technology or my digital life and relationship it's too much. It's taking me away from God. Whatever it is, if we have discerned it ourselves, I got a problem. What do you recommend for kind of escaping the idol of technology and turning back to God? Anything practical tips you can give us?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. It's funny, one time talking with Joel, one of my co-hosts on the What Would Jesus podcast, we had this conversation, and the first response that both of us kind of had was, well, there should be an app for this. There should be some sort of technology to cure our technology problem. But you see the problem there. You see how we're just going to solve the tech with more tech, and that really doesn't solve it at its root. And if the problem is in our heart, then just another piece of tech is not fundamentally going to solve the problem. Now, you can use different apps to reduce time, and I'm not against those things. I think those things are good to use. I make use of them myself. I have limiters on my social media that I do have on my phone. A lot of social media I don't have on my phone, and I keep that just for my monitor use. But otherwise, I do have like limiters on my apps so that I can keep track of my time, get a weekly report. All that kind of stuff is helpful. Share it with a friend, use covenant eyes. Things like that are very helpful in the Christian life. But you do need to address the God factor. And if you are finding your rest in him, Augustine says our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. And so one of the things that what I long for in Christians is for them to love God. And it's like, well, how do I do that? Can I just set up a 5-minute a day thing to love God? I'm like, no, you can't. It's your whole life, man. It's your whole life. And so do the things that are the things that help you love God. Pray the prayers that are prayers to love God. Do it in all of your life. Read the books that he wrote for you to read and worship him through hearing his word. Go to church every week. And maybe if that's the only thing you can do in the midst of your digital addiction, just get to church on Sunday. Even if you're not on time, just get there. Just get there. Sit. Hear the word of God preached and receive it. You're at a church maybe that they don't do the Lord's table every week. Maybe you are. I'm at a Baptist church. We do it once a month. But if you're at a church that does it every week, then you can do the thing that you need. You don't ultimately need to do something. You need to receive something. You need to receive the gospel. You need to receive the body that Jesus died for you. You need to receive the blood. You need to intake it. And so that's what you need fundamentally is you need God. Yeah, you should do other things than that. But what I want to be careful of is this trap of technology fixing technology problems as if it's just one more killer app away from success. There's no success there ultimately. The problem is in your heart and the void is God. So you need to develop the habits that lead up to that. So a very specific thing for myself would be like a Psalms journal, so that it's just a physical book that has the Psalms on one side and a blank page on the other. And it just gives me a way to pray through God's word and direct my emotions up to God. That's like one practical way, but it's not about these practical tips. It's about, do you love God in your heart? Like what was Moses getting at in the Pentateuch? He wasn't getting at a whole bunch of duties. You read Deuteronomy over and over again, and you'll see it's about your heart, your soul. Do you love God? That's the question. That's where I'd go.
Well, I love that. And thank you for centering us on the things that matter. Do you love God? Like, that's what it's all about. And it's a sober reminder that, there isn't always a technological solution to everything on the planet Earth. That is a temptation we get into a lot. And hey, I'm involved in a lot of like Christians in tech groups on Twitter and as well as on LinkedIn. There's some amazing people creating some really cool technological projects for the Lord, but none of that is replacement. It's help, it's enhancement. It's not a replacement for the thing that you really need. So thank you for reminding us of that. We're wrapping up here pretty soon. We got one last question that we ask all the guests. Before I ask you that question though, Andrew, I do want to just kind of let people know where to find you. If you want to, mention some projects you're working on, you're on 3 podcasts. You got a cool Substack as well. I don't know. Can you name drop those things for us?
So you can find all my stuff at andrewnoble.com. theological.net, and that's the place for those sorts of things. I do a lot of podcasting. One podcast is What Would Jesus Tech? And that's more for the tech angle. One podcast is more from the academic side, and that's with Wyatt Graham and Phil Quatnar. And we're three Canadians who are readers and writers, and we tend to be more for those Christian leaders. And then the third podcast is with my church, that's called Thinking About It, or Thinking About the Faith, Grandview Church. And that's really more for my church, but we're going through the 52 questions and answers of the New City Catechism in 2025, not 2015. And that should be great. So we're doing that soon as well.
Sweetness. Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate you being on, and we'll toss some of those links in the show notes for sure. And I've appreciated all your work. Well, like I said, I got one last question for you to wrap us up today. All the guests get a version of this question, and here is the question for season 2. So, our last question is this. As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live their faith fully for Jesus.
So I know this sounds like a really weird answer to the question, but I really do mean it. Go to church and be there for the whole time. You know, show up, keep your phone in your pocket or leave it at home if you can, and just experience all the flesh and blood and senses that you can experience in that building at that time. One of the things that the greatest technologies do is they dwarf reality. So the Apple Vision, though it's great and uses some of the best technology ever created, it only captures 50% of the color that the human eyeball can naturally see. When you sit there on Sunday morning, you are seeing more color than what you would see on the most expensive virtual reality device. Not that virtual reality is wrong or anything like that, but there's something to experiencing reality and sitting there. And even if you don't like the sermon or the songs or anything like that, just experience it and be physically there instead of the million other places that you could be on your device. We are tempted towards becoming like God ever since the garden. We are tempted to become omnipresent, present in all places at all times. That's what digital devices tempt towards. You can be everywhere. Just download all these apps and be on all of them at the same time. And then you can be in a conference room, at a cool bar, listening to some amazing podcast host. You can do all this kind of stuff all at the same time. No. You can't be omnipresent. Go to church, go to the people of God gathered on a Sunday morning and worship Him with your whole self. That's what I would say.
Well, that is a beautiful thing to say. Thank you so much for all your wisdom today, Andrew. And thank you for choosing to speak today. You know, you can listen other times, you can choose not to speak other times, but this is a podcast, so we appreciate you taking that opportunity to speak and to give us so much value. So you're awesome. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jake. This was fun.
Absolutely. It was fun. I am interested in a lot of the topics you talk about, so it was even extra fun for me, and I know our audience loved it as well. Well, everybody out there checking out the Smashing Idols podcast, you know the drill with podcasts. Go ahead and rate and review, share it. Go and find the highest hill in your hometown and scream about this podcast. But then also, go to church and things like that and be present and embodied, all that jazz as well. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for listening today to Smashing Idols. To learn more about the show and me, Jake Doberenz, head over to jakedoberenz.com and be sure to check us out on Substack. That's jakedoberenz.substack.com. There you can subscribe to this podcast, which comes out every Tuesday morning, and you can subscribe to the newsletter, also called Smashing Idols, which comes out on Friday morning, where I dive into these subjects in a short essay. You can follow me on Twitter and Threads and Instagram and all the places at Jake Doberenz. I'd love to continue the conversation there. All right, everybody, grab those hammers, get to smashing those idols.